Introduction to Monopoly. In the last lectures, we studied perfect competition and how firms maximize their profits in perfect competition. Now we're going to start looking at other market structures. We're going to examine how firms maximize their profits in these other market structures, and we're going to compare the results of such behavior to the benchmark efficiency achieved in perfect competition. In general, we're going to see that these structures don't perform as well as, uh, as firms do in perfect competition. And this is going to be the first instance we'll find in the course of what economists call market failures, situations where the market does not produce the most efficient outcome. Okay, so here's our diagram again of our four different market structures. And we've done perfect competition up at the top there. And now we're jumping down to the bottom to monopoly. This is a market structure where you only have one firm. That firm produces a product that has no close substitutes. Entry into the industry is impossible. And because of these factors, the firm has complete control over price, a very high degree of market power. Now, one thing to understand about the difference between perfect competition and monopoly is that there is now only one firm in the market. Notice that we're not saying that a monopoly is necessarily a big firm. There are plenty of big firms that are not monopolies. For example, all automobile firms, Ford, General Motors, and the like, they're all very big firms, but they're not monopolists because they all compete with each other in the market for cars. The difference between monopoly and perfect competition is now there is only one firm in the market. In effect, that firm is the industry because it's the only firm producing the good in that industry. Okay, so if there's only one firm in this market, we must have some explanation for why that's the case. It's kind of unusual that only one firm would be producing this good. And this is especially true since, as we'll see later, it's possible for a monopolist to have positive long-run economic profits. So we have to have some explanation why other firms don't enter this industry in response to those profits. We saw in our discussion of perfect competition that firms want to enter industries that have supernormal profits. How can those profits exist long-term in monopoly? Well, this means that for monopoly to exist, there must be some barrier to entry that's keeping other firms out. Here's an example of a barrier to entry that preserves a monopoly. This is called a natural monopoly. And this goes back to remember our discussion of long-run average cost curves and economies of scale. If the long-run average cost curve is downward sloping over a sufficiently large range of output that it would fulfill all demand, that is, you've still got a long-run average total cost curve that's downward sloping even when you've reached the quantity where everyone in the United States would want to buy the good. In other words, that means there are big economies of scale and that they persist over these large levels of output that cover the entire market. Because we want to get, when the long run average total cost curve is downward sloping, we want to increase output. We would want to have only one firm producing in this industry. If you tried to have two firms, they would be at lower levels of output with higher cost. So we only have one firm producing in this industry. That's called a natural monopoly because something about the actual production process for the good means that it's preferable to have only one firm in this market. Here's a couple examples of natural monopolies. Cable TV, for example. You lay a bunch of cables in a particular area, and that means that you've expended a lot on this input. If someone else were to come along and try to lay a second system of cables, that wouldn't be efficient. You would really only want to have one firm operating in that market. Likewise, electrical grids. You've got an electrical grid that distributes power. For another firm to enter, they would have to have their own electrical grid. You wouldn't want to have two of them because one does the job. So that again is an example of a natural monopoly. So as we can see from these examples, most of the industries that we tend to think of as utilities are natural monopolies. Provision of electric power, water, cable TV, and the like. Everything we pretty much think of as a utility is a natural monopoly. Let's look at a couple other barriers to entry. There might be only one firm that has access to a particular resource. This used to be the case with diamonds. There was a company called De Beers that essentially owned all of the diamond mines in the world. So De Beers had a monopoly in the provision of diamonds. Since that time, new diamond mines have been discovered that De Beers doesn't own, so it's no longer a monopolist. But at one time, it had the only access to this resource, and therefore it had a monopoly in the supply of diamonds. Another extremely important barrier to entry is that in a very rare and unique circumstance, there are legal barriers to entry in the market. In particular, we're talking about patents. This is a right granted by the government that gives an inventor the right to stop anyone else from producing their invention, that is, by entering the market. So once you have a patent for a particular technology, no one else can produce a good using that technology. This is another reason why we shouldn't think that necessarily being a monopolist means being big. You could have a small firm that has a patent over a particular technology, say a particular type of microchip, and it is the only producer of that microchip. It has a monopoly because of its patent. No one else can enter that market, but it may not necessarily be a very big firm. It's just the only firm in that market. Some other barriers to entry come from firm behavior. Firms may behave in a way that stops other firms from entering their market. They can do things like buying up all their competitors, forcing buyers to sign exclusive contracts, temporarily dropping prices to force competitors out of business, and then raising them once there's no one else to compete with them. These are all examples of the type of behavior that firms can do to drive out competitors and in effect create a barrier to entry with their behavior. Now, in the 19th century, there were a lot of firms that engaged in these kind of practices. They were generally referred to as trusts. For example, the Standard Oil Company had a monopoly on the provision of petroleum products in the 19th century, mainly by engaging in these kinds of practices. It was quickly learned that this kind of behavior didn't lead to an efficient market, so a whole new area of law was passed called antitrust law to stop firms from using their behavior to create barriers to entry for other firms.